Hello everyone. This video is going to be a little different to my others. I'm going to give a rough overview of every faction and how it plays to help you guys pick a faction for Warhammer 40k. I'll try to cover every faction that has a codex released in 8th edition, as well as any other things that are worth considering that isn't part of a codex. This isn't going to be a super complex, in-depth review of every faction, and I will try to take the armies out of a meta perspective and consider how the army should play, assuming all the units, stratagems, and sub-factions are perfectly balanced. So how am I going to evaluate the factions? I think you can boil down the majority of how any faction plays into two triangles. On one triangle, you have the offensive playstyle, which is how the faction deals damage to your opponents. Then on the second triangle is the defensive playstyle, which describes how an army stays alive. Obviously, there is more nuance than just that, but I will try to elaborate on why an army ends up in a particular part of the triangle. The edges of the first triangle are made up of shooting, melee, and powers. Do note that while a faction may end up in the corner of one of the triangles, it does not mean that it cannot do the other two, it just means that it doesn't accomplish it particularly well. As for what powers means, it basically makes up both psychic powers and any other ways of doing mortal wounds or buffing units through non-psychic powers. Basic auras like rerolls to hit and morale don't count. As for the defensive triangle, it is made up of tankiness, numbers, and maneuverability, which I think are all reasonably self-explanatory. Maneuverability is both made up of your movement and any other thing that doesn't directly contribute to tankiness. So let's start off the Imperium armies, and might as well begin with the poster boys of the Imperium. That's right, the Nah, just kidding, it's the Space Marines. Space Marines, or Adeptus Astartes, are the elite of the Imperium's frontline forces and the vanguard against the threats from beyond and within. They're a pretty good all-rounder army, although I think it's probably easier to talk about Primaris and Old Marines separately because I think the playstyle differs quite a bit. So, Old Marines, offensively, play in the middle of the field. They don't have insanely long-range weapons save for a few vehicles and Devastator Marines. They often deal their damage in the shooting phase and charge in the later turns to clear up whatever's left from the shootings. Between Terminators, Dreadnoughts and Assault Squads, they have a decent amount of melee to make me say that they are a decent balance between shooting and melee. They do have a significant amount of powers as well, having units like the Librarian and Chaplain, which give out buffs and deal damage using their powers. While the Psychers do match a lot of the others, they don't really have anything that makes them stand head and shoulders above the best. As for Primaris, their offensive power lies mostly in their really strong shooting. Having a longer range and easier access to armor piercing, Primaris generally want to form a gun line to kill the opponent before they can get their melee units in charge range. Not to say that Primaris are bad in melee, they do get an extra attack over the normal Marine equivalents, and they do have a couple of good melee units. It's just I'd say Old Marines have more of a melee options. They also have access to the same psychic powers as the regular Marines do as well, so they have some amount of power ability as well. Space Marines are a bit less of an all-rounder when it comes to defenses. They're definitely in the tankiness category, but they don't have the same number of insanely high saves as the Custodes or the insane number of wounds the Knights do. Their movement is pretty average, having some fast and some slow units. It all averages out to be the same. And as for their numbers, it ends up being on the smaller side. Definitely not as low as Custodes and Knights as I said, but definitely less numerous than something like the Imperial Guard or Sisters of Battle. The only difference between Primaris and Old Marines in this regard is that Primaris have more wounds and cost more. We might as well quickly cover the non-codex compliant Space Marine chapters as well. They end up having a pretty similar playstyle to normal Marines, but vary slightly. Space Wolves focus quite a bit more on melee, having a fair handful of dedicated melee units with things like the Wolfram. Blood Angels also have a fair few melee units and tend to focus on deep striking units, which bumps up their maneuverability a bit with units like the Death Company. And finally there's the Dark Angels, who don't really change too much from the Marines formula, but have the specialised Raven Wing and Deathwing for their speedy and elite units respectively. Okay, moving on from Marines, we'll do the main fighting force of the Imperium, the front line who lay their lives down for the Imperium, with the Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum. With the main fighting force of the Guard not being super soldiers enhanced for decades with super soldier juice, they aren't exactly that good in melee. There are a few exceptions with the super muscly Ogrins, but as a general rule of thumb, you want to keep your tanks and artillery shooting from a safe distance. As for powers, the Guard have by far the cheapest Psychers, but they're not exactly psychically mighty, nor do they have any other powers outside of dropping more artillery on people. As for the Guard's defences, they tend to rely on sheer number of bodies to protect their important tanks and artillery. Their vehicles are more on the side of tanky, although you still don't really want them to be on the target of enemies' charges or shooting attacks. As for the mobility, the Guard don't really want to be fully castled up in their deployment zone, but they don't exactly have the fastest or most mobile units. The Deathcores of Krieg and the Scions are also pretty similar to Guard. They both more expensive than normal guardsmen and don't vary too much from the original guard template, focusing a bit more on shooting the melee and generally using numbers to your advantage. There was also the Elysian drop troops, who had the ability to jump down like the Scions did, but they've kind of been replaced by the Scions, and the drop troops have basically been discontinued, so you may have difficulty making an army for them. Next up is the Adeptus Mechanicus, the cybernetically upgraded humans who are definitely still humans and use their vast knowledge of technology, biology, chemistry and physics to power their own empire as well as the Imperium of Man. As far as offensive power goes, they rely on their long-range backline to dish out damage while the mid-range and combat units advance up the board. They are much better in melee than guardsmen, typically having a better weapon skill and actually having far more dedicated melee units. They do lack the psychic might that comes with playing guard and a lot of other factions, and therefore they end up in the middle of shooting and melee with a slight emphasis towards shooting. Defensively, the Admech are pretty middle of the ground. They aren't so cheap that they can overwhelm the enemy, nor are they as tanky as Marines or anything tougher. Their mobility varies from moderate to good, so placing them pretty much in the dead center of the triangle feels somewhat appropriate. The Adeptus Sororitas or Sisters of Battle are normal women inside of power armor using their devotion and faith in the Emperor to power through all enemies of the Imperium. They are another faction without psychic powers or much way to do damage outside of shooting and melee. They have a pretty even balance between the two, being able to favour one side or the other depending on what sort of style of army and subfaction you choose. I will also bundle in the Ministorum here because they are under the Sisters of Battle codex, and while they aren't strictly Sisters of Battle units, they do complement them well. Typically, the Ministorum units focus incredibly heavily on melee. Defensively, the Sisters of Battle are once again a bit of a middle ground army. They don't really have a great amount of mobility outside of their jetpack troops, but between tankiness and the numbers they can find a reasonable balance. Their troops do cost a fair bit, so there is slight emphasis on tankiness here. The Ministorum units also focus somewhat on numbers and with a bit of tankiness as well. They typically don't have quite as good saves as the Sisters do. Next up is the Adeptus Custodes, loyal only to the Emperor. These handcrafted beyond super soldiers are the Imperium's finest warriors. They too lack the psychic might that other factions possess, but make up for it with some of the most brutal melee and shooting in the game. I would definitely favour their melee over their shooting, as some of the strongest weapons are carried on their infantry. As they are handcrafted by the Emperor himself, these guys do not come in large numbers and instead rely on their insane level of tankiness to survive. They do have reasonable amount of mobility, being able to have very fast flying vehicles, which edges them above the Sisters in mobility, but not a lot further than that. These guys are definitely about the elite few more than anything else. To quickly add the Sisters of Silence on here, they act as a support force to most Imperium armies, but they have a slight better synergy with the Custodes. They are a primary anti-psyker thing, being able to force a lot of powers to just straight up fail. As such, they sort of end up in the middle of shooting and melee with the inability to cast any sort of spells or have any sort of buffs like that. Defensively, they are actually surprisingly weak and actually cost more than Sisters of Battle normally, despite having basically the same stat line. They do have slightly above average movement, which compensates for it a little though. Now we move on to the hulking behemoths of the Imperium, the Imperial Knights. Firstly, no psychic powers, so you know the drill. Between melee and shooting, I'd say the Knights favour shooting, seeing as they have some really powerful long-range weapons, and you lose a fair bit of tankiness in melee. There are of course some melee knights, especially if you delve into the Forge World Knights, so here more than ever there is a large amount of variance in how offensive power goes. Just build the knights how you want to play them or magnetize them and try out stuff until you find something you want to play. Now defenses are where the knights become a lot more consistent. You'll always find you are fielding less units, but the units you do have will be some of the hardest to take down. They do have decent mobility, especially compared to the average unit, but considering their size and small amount of units you're going to be having on the board, they'll often find themselves having to chase around units that can weave in and out of terrain and other things the knight cannot move through. Now we have the Psychic Warriors of the Imperium, the Grey Knights. Being some of the most elite marines and imbued with psychic powers, they are definitely one of the most powers-based factions in the game. They're also really strong in both melee and shooting, but nothing quite matches the ability to have every unit cast psychic powers. This makes them very versatile when it comes to their offensive capabilities, so in playing them you'll need to know what units are meant to do what and how to use them to their maximum efficiency. As for their defenses, they are the most elite of marines, and that comes with the extra defenses and costs, or at least it would do for anything better than a regular strike squad. They also come with deep strike being built into them, which bumps up their mobility quite a significant amount. Finally, we finish off the major Imperial factions with the Xenos Hunters, the Death Watch. They are just more marines. They have similar offensive and defensive power. They do have special mechanics that allow them to use special ammunition and fight specific Xenos better, but as the Death Watch are solely made up of other marines, they'll be pretty familiar to a marine player. Titans, Inquisition, Officio Assassinorum and Rogue Traders don't really have enough in them to make a full army, but I'll quickly mention what benefits they give to your armies, if you want to add some of them into your Imperial armies. Titans are huge, tanky and expensive super knights that are basically meant only for apocalypse games. The Inquisition are meant for giving morale buffs and usually designed for flavour for your army. Officio Assassinorum are the assassins of the Imperium with a mixture of close combat beasts and long-range sniper characters. And finally there's Rogue Traders, a selection of characters primarily from Blackstone Fortress which only really have rules so you can play these characters in 40k. Basically if you have Blackstone Fortress, you can throw them into Imperial army. Now that we've covered the Imperium, let's delve into Chaos. To start, we'll cover Chaos Space Marines. Chaos Space Marines have a pretty similar style to the Imperium Space Marines, albeit with a lot more spikes and Dark God worshipping. Offensively, Chaos does offer quite the variety of playstyles, but taking the average of just the Chaos Space Marines, they are basically a perfect centre. They have a decent variety of good psychic powers, they have an array of powerful shooting options, and they have some very nasty melee units. They don't do one thing the best, but the options you get are pretty nice. You may want to specialise your offences towards melee with World Eaters and Corn Berserkers, shooting with Emperor's Children and Noise Marines, or psychic with just a ton of Sorcerers and Demon Princes. Defensively, the Chaos Space Marines primarily focus on power over numbers, much like their regular Marine equivalents. They do have some cheap infantry with cultists, and in general Chaos Space Marines are cheaper than the Primaris, so they will outweigh the Marines' bodies typically. As for mobility, the Chaos Space Marines are pretty much equal to their regular Marine equivalents again, so in the end they just are slightly closer to the centre than Imperium Space Marines. Unlike the non-codex compliant Space Marine chapters, the Thousand Sons and Death Guard play quite differently to the normal Chaos Space Marines. Firstly, the Thousand Sons. They're kinda like Chaos's counterparts to the Grey Knight, except instead of having anti-demon stuff, they can take demons. Once again, while being focused on psychic powers, they don't completely give up their ability to shoot or fight in melee. Thousand Sons shooting is actually quite a bit more menacing than their melee though, so if you're looking for a shooting psychic army, these will probably be your best bet. As for the defenses, Thousand Sons are pretty tanky, but that comes at the cost of the number of models you can bring. Their movability also isn't as good as normal Chaos Space Marines either, lacking bikers and jetpack troops. The normal troops still move at an average movement speed at least though. Death Guard, instead of specialising into psychic powers, go for a bit more of a melee focus. They still have a pretty strong shooting and some good psychic powers, so I'll put them in an all-rounder with a slight leaning towards melee for offensive power. Defensively though is where Death Guard change up the Space Marine formula significantly. They sacrifice most of their ability on their infantry to make them pretty tanky. Not quite Custodes level of tanky, but definitely tough in their own right. And there are some pretty mobile Death Guard units, but the vast majority of their units are pretty slow, so their placement on the triangle pulls them further away from mobility. Now we move on to the non-marine Chaos things, starting with Chaos Demons. As a general gist, the demons are a very melee focus with some pretty strong psychic powers, however that doesn't hold up when you look at each sub-faction within the Chaos Demons. Playing a mono sub-faction demons army usually isn't recommended, but this will tell you roughly how each of the demons plays so you can fit the puzzle pieces together. So we'll start with Khorne. Khorne offensively is the most melee sub-faction in the game, having pretty much only melee weapons and no psychic powers and barely any ranged weapons. Defensively, Khorne has a bit of everything depending on the size of the demon. The Bloodletters rely on numbers, Blood Crushers mobility, and Bloodthirsters tankiness. Nurgle offensively is pretty much only melee, with a tiny bit of psychic powers tied in from the Demon Prince and the Great Unclean One. Defensively, the Nurgle demons are all about their tankiness. They do get a fair few numbers with their cheapish Plague Bearers, but the point they'll always be lacking in is their mobility. Tzeentch demons are next. More psychic, less melee. They even have some shooting tied into them with some flaming units. Defensively, Tzeentch comes pretty close to the middle with a slight emphasis on mobility. Their units aren't usually super elite and rare despite having pretty good invulnerable saves, so you can expect to see a fair number of models, but not exactly a swarm. The only thing that is particularly different about them is their mobility, which is quite high for all units except the most basic ones. Finally there is Slaanesh. Offensively, they are pretty much only melee, with a tiny amount of psychic powers. They can easily outdo Nurgle for melee, as they nearly always get to the fight before everyone else. Defensively, Slaanesh is all about speed. They try to get into combat and slaughter everyone in melee before they can get shot to death. They also can come in greater numbers than most of the other demons, so expect to need swarms of demonettes to do some serious damage. You can't easily combine the Chaos Demons into a single thing, so I'm gonna leave each demon's placement separate. Yeah, let's tie up Chaos things with Chaos Knights. They're pretty much the same as Knights, both defensively and offensively. The only thing that really differentiates the Chaos Knights from the normal Knights is some war gear and weapon options. There are also some rules to play Renegades, Heretics, and Chaos Titans. Renegades and Heretics play pretty similarly to Guard, but with more spiky bits, and the Titans are literally the same as the Imperium's Titans, but once again with more spiky bits. Okay, now we can move on to the Xenos. We'll go through the Eldar first, then end this video off with the rest of the Xenos. The Craftworld Eldar are one of the last groups of the dying race that used to rule the galaxy, seeking to survive the clutches of Slaanesh who slaughtered their race. Offensively, the Craftworld Eldar has some very strong psychic powers, very strong shooting, and some okay melee units. Typically, Eldar units lack the strength to hit hard in melee, or lack the mobility to get reliably into melee, although what Eldar are doing will vary from edition to edition. The only thing consistent is their great psychic powers. Overall, this puts them, at least currently, in a balance between shooting and powers. Defensively, Eldar are surprisingly fragile, but don't really come in large quantities. Typically, their units aren't cheap either, so how do Eldar survive on the tabletop? Well, they use a mixture of their lightning-fast reflexes and high maneuverability on their infantry to stay alive. Their tanks use their ability to fly and their high mobility to stay out of the line of fire. As for their walkers, they are designed to be reasonably tanky, but the majority of the Eldar survivability will be coming from their mobility. Drukhari are the other major faction of the Eldar, who hide in the webway in their city of Commorragh, kidnapping and raiding members of the Imperium to perform the most sinister and depraved experiments. The Eldar usually use a hit-and-run style of play, but the Drukhari take that and turn it up to 11. Offensively, they have a mixture of melee and shooting, but lack any sort of psychic powers. For the shooting and melee balance, they definitely favour melee over shooting, as that is where they can do the most damage. They still can shoot, and pretty well at that too, but it's often there more to soften up enemies before they can engage. Defensively, they're almost the same as the Craftworlds, relying on high mobility rather than tankiness to keep their low number of units alive. You can still get a large number of models on the table if you take certain units, but typically you'll find you'll have less units on the table than, say, Tyranids. Harlequins are elite mercenaries of the Eldar that also dress like clowns. The Harlequins are a bit more of a supporting army, but they can be run as their own if you want. Do note they have very few options when it comes to making unit choices. Aside from all that, the army offensively plays with close range shooting and some strong melee mixed in. They also have a bit of psychic power, as one of their 2 HQ options has psychic abilities. Defensively, the Harlequins are even more elite than either of the other 2 Eldars and rely on their tankiness and mobility to stay alive. They won't be outnumbering many armies on the table, and you have to rely on their saves to either take shots or deal enough damage to your opponent to make sure they can't shoot you back. Finally, in the Eldar set is the Ynnari. These guys allow you to play as any combination of the previous Eldar units. The best way to look at how the Ynnari play is to take the average of all the Eldar factions, weighted depending on how useful or the quantity of a particular faction's units you want to use. I will note that their ability favours them in melee particularly. Generally, I would say you should choose one of the prior armies. Then if you like the look of other Eldar units, or you just want to take units from another Eldar's factions, then you should look into playing these guys. Finally, let's cover the last of the Xenos factions. These factions tend to be their own armies and play independently more than the other groups, because you can't actually play them together without using house rules, except for Tyranids and Genestealers. Let's start with the Necrons, the endless armies of undying robotic space Egyptians looking to claim the galaxy. Offensively, Necrons have a pretty nice balance between shooting and powers. They're actually the reason I named the section powers and not psychic ability. Using their Catan shards, they can deal damage in a similar way to a Psyker. Necrons also have pretty strong gun lines with lots of infantry, flaying Gauss weaponry. They do have some dedicated melee units as well, but until the new releases they tend to be a bit more to support the gun line over a dedicated melee playstyle. Defensively, you'd think the Necrons would be very slow but very tanky, however the actual playstyle is much further than raw tankiness than you might think. Yes, their infantry is very slow but tanky, but the Necrons are more than just infantry. Their vehicles, planes, constructs and elite infantry are all fairly mobile and can fly to boot. Moving on now to the Orcs, the unstoppable green tide of monstrous aliens that know nothing but war. Before I got deeper into this video, I expected Orcs to be a pretty well balanced army, having strong options for everything. However, looking into other factions really does show that Orcs outshine them in melee, and they get outshined by shooting and psychic quite often. Orcs are debatably the strongest melee in the game, only really being beaten by Khorne demons. Their shooting is used to pick off priority targets or units you can't really charge into, and the psychic powers are there mainly to help your melee be more effective. Neither the shooting nor psychic powers struggle to do damage on their own, but every Orc army should include some melee to best use the faction's strengths. Orcs are also one of the best hordes in the game, having cheap but very strong infantry without much armour. Orcs are also surprisingly slow when they aren't in one of their ramshackle vehicles. This puts them very solidly in the numbers category for their defences. Outweighing your opponent in bodies will be a good way to make sure something connects to get your really powerful melee off. The Tau Empire are the youngest major player in the galaxy. United under the common goal of the greater good, the Tau seek to expand their empire through diplomacy, or force if necessary. The Athough basically are the shooting gatekeepers. Melee armies are always going to have a rough time against an army that can shoot from afar, and also as they charge in. Athough do find themselves pretty lackluster melee, so when that connection is made, they tend to get pretty badly beaten. They have very few options, and often find the options for melee are outdone by factions that don't even specialise in melee. The Athough also have no connection to the warp, so no psychic powers. They don't really have a substitute for psychic powers either, so this puts them incredibly solidly in the shooting section. Defensively, Athough play in a very different way to any other faction. Instead of units themselves tanking shots and screening with weaker units to prevent your stronger units from being charged, you instead have drones which absorb shots to prevent any of your units from taking damage. These drones come in high quantity, and I guess their infantry is quite cheap as well, which push them towards the numbers category. Yet their battle suits are all quite tanky and mobile to boot. As I have to place them somewhere on the triangle, they can be placed slightly off the centre towards the numbers and mobility categories. Tyranids are an innumerable horde of cosmic beasts from outside the galaxy, looking to tear through any biomass to add to their high fleets. Tyranids on the offense play with a surprisingly balanced playstyle. Yes, they have amazing melee units, but that ignores all the large monsters they use as artillery and backline tanks. They also have some incredibly strong psychics in their army, and their Shadow in the Warp will always give them an edge over other psychic armies. This leads Tyranids to be a very balanced army, with only a slight leaning towards melee. As for defences, Tyranids are most well known for their hordes upon hordes of tiny bugs, but there are other playstyles for the Tyranids. They can play with their huge beasts, hulking up the board and taking shots, although I would always recommend having lots of smaller bugs to tie up your opponent, and absorb shots from the more important bugs. They can outnumber even the Orcs in terms of body count, so that's always something to consider. As for mobility, the Tyranids are actually pretty fast across the board, which complements their focus on melee. Finally, to round off all the major and some minor factions in Warhammer 40k, we have the Genestealer cults. The Genestealer cults are Tyranids that splinter off from hive fleets. They infiltrate worlds, decapitating leaderships and destabilizing places. Offensively, the Genestealer cults take a lot from both Guard and Tyranids. You could almost just mash the two together to get a decent representation of their offensive power. They have some psychic powers, but they are not exceptional at it. They do have very good melee, but apart from a small selection of units, they don't really specialise in it. And of course there's finally the shooting, which is okay. Personally, I think you need a mix of all three to make effective use out of Genestealer cults. Defensively, Genestealer cults have to play off their incredible cult ambush ability. This allows them to spring up all over the place and quickly engage and slaughter the opponents before they get a chance to fight back. Genestealer cults lack good saves that a lot of armies get, so they must rely on their first strike to be a decisive one. They can produce a large number of bodies on the table, but playing them like a swarm of Orcs or Tyranids will often find them riddled with holes before they can get their damage out. Right, there we go. That's every faction. I hope this video has helped you a little bit on deciding what playstyle will suit you when choosing a 40k faction. I know this video isn't fully comprehensive or perfect, and to not date the video, the descriptions of rules are a little vague, but I just wanted this video to encourage you to find a faction you might like. I know this has been a little different from my usual style, but I'll be back to finishing off as many 8th edition codexes as I can after this video. Still, let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and if you'd like to see more content like this, a subscription would be appreciated. Finally, I'd like to thank you all for watching.